Hello and welcome to another edition of Sree's Sunday New York Times Read Along. Our guest this week is Professor Manisha Sinha from the University of Connecticut. She's an historian and author. You can follow her on Twitter and Instagram at Prof. M. Sinha. My name is Neil Parekh. I'm sitting in as the guest host today. We're live on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube, Instagram, and our Digimentors website. Please like, please comment, please share, please do all the things you do on social media so that people can see this show. It's going to be a great conversation. Uh, Professor Sinha has a new book, The Rise and Fall of the Second American Republic, focusing on Reconstruction. It offers us a framework to understand current politics, particularly the conservative pushback against the gains that we've had over in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, civil rights, women's rights, LGBTQ rights. The pushback we're seeing now has its antecedents in Reconstruction when Reconstruction fell and it opened up a whole era in the South, Jim Crow, etc. So we're going to hear about that. We're, of course, going to talk about current politics and events. Kamala Harris, everyone's very, very excited, uh, except for Donald Trump, of course. We're going to talk about some of the comments he's made in recent times and some of the identity politics around that. So please join us. It's going to be a great conversation. Want to say hi to a few folks who are joining us. Jonathan is watching from the East Village. Jonathan, thank you so much for being such a loyal viewer every week in, week out. Thank you. Dr. Sujana Chandrasekhar saying good morning, all. Sujana, thank you so much for all of your support and all of your sharing on social media. Patricia Freudenberg watching from New York, offering her greetings from there. Patricia, thank you. It's always great to see familiar faces right off the bat. Doug Levy watching from near San Francisco, Marin County, if I'm not mistaken. We always like to point out it's 5:30 a.m. Pacific time for Doug. He's a radio, a long time, not old, a long time radio guy. So he's used to getting up early, but we do appreciate all of our West Coast viewers. And if you're watching on replay, thank you so much for watching the show. That's one of the things we like about being able to stream to social media is that you can watch live or later at your convenience. The video is there forever. My mom is watching from Hastings. Hi, Mom. I think it was last Sunday that I broke the news that, Mom, I'm going to be up in New York this weekend on Friday. We're coming over for dinner, Pam and I. So look forward to seeing you there. And it's even a good time to mention we're not going to have a show next week because Pam and I will be at a wedding next weekend. So no show August 11th, but we'll talk more about that later. Pradnya is watching from Silver Spring, Maryland. Harris for POTUS. Vote blue. And notice her profile picture is that great picture of Kamala Harris with the caption in Sanskrit, Kamala means lotus. In English, Kamala means POTUS, President of the United States, if you don't know the acronym. Gunther is watching from Austria. Gunther, thank you so much. Naomi, good morning, says good morning from a humid Upper West Side. It was so humid down in DC yesterday. We'd walk out, glasses would fog up. It was like a hot wind would come in right at you. Not fun. Not fun at all. Shashi is watching on YouTube, saying hello from Maryland. Thank you so much, Shashi. Thank you so much for all the work you do sharing this show on social media. And Jimmy Carter is watching from North Carolina. Thank you, Jimmy. If folks didn't see Jimmy Carter's namesake, the other Jimmy Carter, if you will, announced that he is holding on. The man is 99 years old. He's been in hospice for a year and a half. He is holding on so he could vote for Kamala Harris for president. Just incredible. Just incredible. And Stephen Kaplan is watching from Ramsey, New Jersey, saying hi to the New York Times Read Along family. Thank you, Stephen. Appreciate all of your support, everyone who is joining us. Again, Professor Manisha Sinha is our guest, and we are live on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube, and our Digimentors website. We appreciate all the support you can give to the show. Anything you can do to retweet, to share, to like, etc., makes a huge difference in terms of getting the show out. So thank you very much. So what we're going to do is I'm going to take a look at the paper real quick, just the front page, and then we're going to bring on Professor Sinha so we can get this conversation going. So let's go ahead and bring up the paper. I'm riding solo here today, folks, so appreciate your patience with any technical issues that might come up. We certainly do our best when we do the show like this. So this front page, just incredible. There's a great image on the front page that is a climate story. So that display photo is scientist warns wants to block sunlight to cool Earth. Growing interest in bold plan despite grave risks. So an interesting climate piece at the very top. The lead story, and we will certainly be talking about this with Manisha right away. Trump paints his opponent as an other. You may have seen his comments at the NABJ, the National Association of Black Journalists conference. But the subhead, Old Tactic, tries to sow suspicion about Harris. Absolutely. And Adam Nagorny wrote the piece. He is the Times lead political writer. He was a guest on our show several months ago. But we'll definitely want to dig into that because there was all sorts of wrong around those comments. On the other side, looted goods flood markets in Gaza streets. Power vacuum in war fuels lawlessness. Below the fold, who could not cheer Katie Ledecky of the United States? Here, the headline says she tied the women's Olympic record for career gold medals. I thought she actually broke it, and that might just be a timing thing in terms of when the print edition came out. For Ukrainians on the home front, many are facing a love crisis. So that's more on the war in Ukraine. And we'll want to take a look at this article here. Contestants said it was chaos vying for Mr. Beast's $5 million. Mr. Beast is a YouTuber, and we don't understand. I admit I have not watched him closely enough to really understand what he's doing, but it does not make sense in terms of what we hear from what Emily tells us about him. But the kids love him, and that certainly gives us pause. I do want to point out the ad on the bottom of the page, well timed, a Skechers by Snoop Dogg 30th anniversary edition for Doggy Style. Snoop Dogg has been all over the Olympics, and people have been questioning why has he been getting so much visibility. He is very active in the nonprofit space as a supporter, commentator. I know Stefan tweeted about him carrying or posted about him carrying the torch in the opening, but he has been all over the media with custom NBC jackets, custom made NBC jackets. So that's been really interesting. But with that opening, let's go ahead and bring on our guest, Professor Manisha Sinha. As I mentioned earlier, Professor Sinha is a historian and author at the University of Connecticut, and she is the author of The Rise and Fall of the Second American Republic, Reconstruction, 1860 to 1920. With that, we welcome Professor Manisha Sinha.
Thank you
Manisha,
for having me, Neil.
thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. And we're going to jump right into things. We'll talk about your book, but that lead article in the paper that we looked at just a second ago, and I'll pull it up in case folks missed it. Trump paints his opponent as an other. Old tactics try to sow suspicion against Harris. This is not new for Donald Trump. He's been doing this for years, obviously, with the birth certificate questions he had about Obama, etc. I'm going to ask you a series of questions about your reactions to different events in the last several weeks, but let's work backwards. When you first heard the comments that Donald Trump made about Kamala Harris at the NABJ convention, something to the effect of, all of a sudden, she's black. I always thought she was Indian, and now she turned black. What's going on? What did that? How did you react to that? What was your kind of first impressions?
Well, it seemed like a really old political tactic for Donald Trump, as you mentioned, right? He has a knack for trying to sow racial divisions, even while he's trying to appeal to African Americans. So, in trying to cast doubt at Kamala Harris's, the black half of her identity, he actually was trying to appeal to black voters by saying she's not black enough. And this is very ironic coming from a man who's known for his racism, known for his real estate business, is discriminating against African Americans in New York City, his false allegations against the Central Park Five that was so harmful. So this is old hat for him. And I think it's also a very old tactic in US history to try and win elections, appeal to people based on sowing racist divisions. And sometimes it has been successful, and sometimes it hasn't. And I guess this is what Lincoln meant when he said, appeal to the better angels of your nature rather than your worst passions. Um, but I think for Trump, this may have backfired because I think a lot of African American journalists who were present there were rather insulted by his attempt to try to read out Kamala Harris's identity. We know that in the United States, according to the so-called one-drop rule, anyone, even though they may even appear virtually white, and there were in fact many African American leaders who appeared virtually white, were by this unscientific, bizarre notion, characterized as being something. And it's rather rich to have somebody, indulge in identity politics when their entire sort of campaign has been against the idea of identity politics, against the idea of talking about one's background. So, all in all, as I said, it was to be expected. Um, and there are lots of examples in American history when this has played out. But with Trump, just when you think he can't go further to the bottom, he in fact does that.
Sure, sure. So, and that was, I think, I mean, like you said, a familiar trope that was trotted out, but frustrating nonetheless. Both of us are parents of mixed race children, and that whole idea that you can't hold more than one identity at the same time it makes me. I mean, I have been very encouraged, and I've felt good about the world that my daughter is growing up in terms of looking at her school, her classmates. So many of the families around us have mixed background. It's just a reminder of not only where we were and where we might go back to if Trump is elected again. Um, so that
Yes.
was your reaction when you heard these words, and this was coming out. Let's go back a few weeks to when President Biden uh, decided that he would not run again and instead endorsed Kamala Harris as the potential nominee. What was your reaction at that point?
Yes, so as you said earlier, it's such an American story. People from different ethnicities and backgrounds coming together, meeting here, getting married, having children. So what Trump did was not just racist, but also rather un-American. I would add. In terms of President Biden actually stepping aside and then endorsing Kamala Harris um, shortly afterwards. I have to say, I was one of those diehard Democrats who was sticking along with Biden despite all the criticisms of him. I just thought it was so dangerous to switch horses midstream that you could, in fact, have a problem like we did in 1968 when the Democratic Party imploded when LBJ decided not to run for a second term. But I have to give President Biden credit. He managed this so expertly. Firstly, we know he was negotiating to get Americans and dissenters, Russian dissenters, out of Russia just as he made this decision. That it did not take his, eyes off the ball in terms of his work, and that's rather admirable. Um, Secondly, he did it so well. He did it immediately after the RNC when they had wasted and occupied themselves completely with attacking Biden. So they were caught completely flat footed. They couldn't switch quickly. So it shows a little bit of political savvy also on Biden's part, the way he made these announcements, how he delayed it after the RNC was over and then handed the baton to Vice President Harris. And the manner he did that avoided all the political chaos and confusion that I was dreading. In fact, we see that the transition from his campaign from to her campaign was very seamless, both in terms of fundraising, campaign funds, but also some of the staff. And then came to the complete surprise of many seasoned political pundits who have constantly underestimated and belittled our vice president, um, see this massive amount of fresh new energy and enthusiasm for the Democratic Party ticket and for Kamala Harris's candidacy. Her speeches also, I think, indicated how much she had matured as vice president. She was doing really well on the stump, and people were impressed. They took a second look and they said, "Aha, she really has the chops."
Uh,
Um, there was an article in the New York Times about foreign leaders who had met with her and who were impressed by her savvy. So she was clearly ready to assume the reins at this point. So it all went off, like a dream for most Democrats. And
Absolutely.
people were somewhat giddy at how well it was managed and done, and how the Democratic Party quickly unified around her candidacy. There were a few naysayers here and there, but it actually was done very well, and I was thrilled. And like many people, I was enthusiastic. I joined the South Asian Women for Kamala and
Hmm.
contributed beyond my means to her campaign. So I feel as if I contributed to that big haul that we
Sure.
had. And then my husband, who is German, German American now, um, he really disdains identity politics. He doesn't like people talking about identity constantly. He finds that very strange. But he wanted to join the White Dudes for Kamala
White dudes.
cause.
Yeah.
So I thought, well, this message has really resonated, and Kamala did break Zoom, and she
Yeah.
did have a historic haul in of campaign funds, and that kind of grassroots enthusiasm was really heartening to see.
And when you talk about the enthusiasm and the different groups that came together, as you may know, Sri and I helped organize South Asian Men for Harris as a
Mhm.
follow up to the South Asian Women for Harris event. This was last Saturday, and next on Wednesday, we're actually going to be producing. At their request, Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander Men for Kamala, which is another outgrowth, another one of these affinity groups. And people have questioned, is this identity politics? Is this segregation? Why are these different groups popping up? I think that it's a brilliant, and it's very organic for the most part, but it's a brilliant approach because it gives people a way to plug in I mean, you see everything from childless cat ladies for Kamala to writers for Kamala, et cetera. It gives people a place to belong. But at the end of the day, they're part of a larger whole. They're part of a larger movement, which I think is absolutely wonderful. So we're looking forward to more of these. We'll be doing more events. South Asian Men for Harris. We're planning on doing a few more events before the end of the before the elections, of course.
It
So
seems
let's
like a quintessential American thing, right?
yes,
Having all these different groups being represented and coming together. My favorite, which I saw on Twitter, excuse me, was when Trump called all Jewish people who are for Kamala Harris, and he called Doug Emhoff, the second gentleman, hopefully the first gentleman soon, a crappy Jew.
wow.
And so this woman on Twitter, she put together crappy Jews for Kamala. And I thought that was hilarious.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's make a few quick announcements first, and then we're going to go. We're going to talk about your book and the lessons that we can learn from history. As a reminder, we want to thank our sponsor Muckrack, a longtime sponsor of the New York Times Read Along and a supporter of a lot of Sri's projects. So thank you to Muckrack. And if you're interested in being a sponsor, please send us an email, sri@digimentors.group or neil@digimentors.group. This show, of course, is produced by Digimentors, the firm that Sri started with his friend and colleague from Columbia, Andrew Lee. I am proud to be a vice president of events and communications. We do digital marketing, events and programs like this, strategic communications, trainings, and workshops. We also help with staffing and recruiting. Sri has been leading a lot of workshops on AI. So if you're interested in learning more, please reach out to us and we would love to talk with you about some of our projects. We have a number of other people who have joined in the last few minutes. I just want to bring them in real quick, and then we will get back to Manisha Sinha. And I'm after having to call back up. Naomi Service said President Jimmy Carter, former President Jimmy Carter, such a mensch, had the pleasure of interviewing him at Temple University when he was running. Kavri Madhavan is saying hello from Ireland. Kavri is going to be a guest on our show in September, talking about the Indian Irish experience. So we're looking forward to that. And Diane Stefani says, "Good morning from Virginia Beach, Virginia Beach, New Jersey. Thank you for all you do. Appreciate that, Diane." Melissa Lutke is saying hi from Cambridge, Massachusetts. Go Katie, go Kamala. And Melissa is going to be a future guest as well. We're looking forward to her book as talking about her experience as a sports writer in the 70s, breaking the barrier and getting into men's locker rooms. So that is great. Paula Kiger, longtime producer of the show, is watching from Tallahassee, Florida. Thank you, Paula. And there's Kathy Ramirez, talking about there is so much strategy in play. Absolutely. And then a few notes for you, Manisha. My mom says, "I'm so glad to hear your analysis about the current political and election situations." So thank you, Mom. And then following up on our conversations earlier, Pradnya says, "My mixed race kids self-identify as Indian, but with caramel skin color." So that is another good perspective. And I also want to bring in this comment, and this is the lead-in for your work, Manisha, from Naomi. Reconstruction and its disgraceful aftermath should be thoroughly taught in the public schools. Dr. Foner, Eric Foner, is a world-renowned authority on the era and helped update Disney's World's Hall of Presidents. I assume you wouldn't object to more education around Reconstruction and the challenges of that era.
Not at
Um,
all, especially since Eric Foner was my advisor at Columbia University when I was in
absolutely.
graduate school there, and he actually did that when I was his graduate student.
Oh wow, that's
Mhm.
incredible. That's incredible. I mean, I'm familiar with. As I was a history major in college myself, not far from where you are at Wesleyan University. And although I've focused on modern European, I actually had heard of Eric Foner back when I was in high school, thanks to really great history teachers there. So with that set up, let's talk about Reconstruction. Let's talk about kind of your framing of it, particularly with an eye of how it was, it evolved out of the Civil War, a great time of progressive movement for Black people, for women, as you think of it, kind of the expanded definition, and then it all came crashing down.
Mhm.
So tell us about that. Walk us through a little bit of the history,
Oh, I'd be happy to. I have
just
a
a
few
little bit,
slides. Okay, a little bit for a bit
right?
here. I have a few slides I'd be happy to share with you. That I talk about my um, about, of course, Reconstruction in my book, but I really have expanded what we understand as the period of Reconstruction, which usually people look at, the period immediately after the Civil War. It's a very brief period, and suddenly by 1877, it's all over when the last Reconstruction state governments in the South fall. And I have a sort of a different scope and timeline for Reconstruction. My book is, of course, called The Rise and Fall of the Second American Republic. And you can immediately see that the timeline goes from 1860 with the election of Abraham Lincoln to the presidency, right up to 1920 with the 19th Amendment that gave women the right to vote. And the reason why I adopted this expanded timeline for Reconstruction is because I don't think most Americans appreciate the significance of Reconstruction and its long term legacies for our times. Um, we always think of American republicanism as kind of a linear, progressive thing with freedom being expanded for more and more people as we go along. And I think on the eve of the semi-quincentennial of the founding of the American Republic, or the 250th anniversary, we have to understand that American republicanism has risen and fallen and has been contested, and that there have been periods in American history where the republic has nearly fallen apart and had to be reconstructed. And this is why I call this period the Second American Republic, or the rise and fall of the Second American Republic. If you look at the tremendous upheavals in US history in the mid to late 19th century, the Civil War itself, in which nearly 750,000 Americans died, more Americans than, the First and Second World War combined, the Korean and the Vietnam War. You have to realize what a cataclysm it was in US history. And then when you look at its aftermath, when you have that brief period when the United States experimented with interracial democracy and Black citizenship in the South, only to have it overthrown, brutally overthrown by a campaign of domestic racist terror, I think we realize that gains that are hard fought for can actually be lost. And this is why I think it's so important to remember Lincoln's um, sort of admonition when he says, fellow citizens, we cannot escape history. Meaning, America is not this mythic and exceptional place that lies outside history, but that in fact it is part of history. And the story of American democracy is part of that history, and the challenges it has faced in the past and continues to face today is part of that history. So that was like the general idea about my book. And then I, of course, do talk about this amazing period, very brief, very contested in the South, especially by Southern economic and political elites who simply cannot accept the results of the Civil War and emancipation. But you have this tremendous period when you have constitutional amendments that literally remake the US Constitution, the first federal civil rights laws being passed. We have cases being contested in federal courts today that evoke Reconstruction era federal civil rights acts that gave freed people civil rights, regardless of color and previous condition of servitude. And those are the ideas that benefit all Americans today of different creeds, ethnicities, and nationalities. You think of some of the consequential Reconstruction constitutional amendments, the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery in 1865, the 14th Amendment that established national birthright citizenship that some people don't like, and established equal protection for all people. This is where we got Roe v. Wade, which is now, of course, been overturned by the Supreme Court in the Dobbs decision. But this is also where you get gay marriage and no discrimination on the basis of sex. So this was a far-reaching amendment that has had an important implication for our modern times. And of course, the 15th Amendment that gave Black men the right to vote. And you have an image there of Black congressmen. People forget that immediately after the Civil War, you had Black senators, Black representatives, and even a governor and lieutenant governors in the South. Imagine going immediately from slavery to that idea of Black citizenship and Black office holding. At the local and state level, thousands of Black people were in office. So it's not just a matter of these laws and amendments, but there's a grassroots effort by African Americans themselves to breathe meaning into their freedom, to claim rights, to claim civil and political rights. The Civil Rights Act of 1875, for instance, banned racial segregation in the South before the rise of Jim Crow. That's how far seeing they were. Of course, the US Supreme Court, which played an extremely reactionary role in undoing many of these laws and amendments, declared this law unconstitutional and green lighted the way for Jim Crow, which it then gave its stamp of approval to in Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. And I go on to argue that even the 19th Amendment of 1920 was really a Reconstruction amendment, even though it's passed during the Progressive era. Its wording is exactly like that of the 15th Amendment that gave Black men the right to vote. And the fight for women's suffrage really takes off during Reconstruction. So I say it's the last Reconstruction Amendment, and that's where I end my book in terms of understanding the contents and nature of American democracy. I will also draw your attention to the Enforcement Acts here. These were acts passed during the Grant administration against racist domestic terror in the South being perpetrated by violent paramilitary groups like the Ku Klux Klan that was founded in 1866, the first Klan, but also other groups like the White League and the White Liners and the Red Shirts of South Carolina, a bit like the brown shirts or black shirts of Nazi Germany and fascist Europe. So it's, this act, the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871, there are three of them passed in 1870, 1871, was actually invoked during the January 6th insurrection in order to put down that insurrection. The 14th Amendment's bar against anyone who has participated in or incited an insurrection against the government of the United States after having sworn an oath of office to uphold the US Constitution was, of course, used against Trump. And unfortunately, the Supreme Court in this case, not just the reactionary right, judges who are openly corrupt and partisan, but even the liberal judges fail to enforce that provision. The only way that you can participate in the US government in the way in which many ex-Confederates did was if you get 2/3 of Congress to pardon you for that act of insurrection. And of course, Trump cannot get that. So, Reconstruction is still alive with us today. These ideas are extremely important for us to remember.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I want to bring in a few comments, Manisha. And first of all, I want to share a comment on Twitter. Professor Kathy Joshi says, looking forward to getting Professor Sinha's new book, The Rise and Fall of the Second American Republic, Reconstruction, 1860 to 1920. If folks saw it on Twitter this week, Professor Joshi shared a takedown of former President Trump's comments about Kamala Harris, sharing an image of Kamala Harris's birth certificate, in a long thread. So thank you, Kathy, for watching. And I want to point out shortly after she put out that tweet, I saw that Sujana actually tagged her in Facebook, uh, asking, letting her know about the show that she might be interested. So Sujana, just so you know, Professor Joshi is watching. She is very interested. But if there are other folks that you think would be interested in this conversation, tag them in the comments so they can join us. We have few other comments that we want to pull up. Specifically, just saying hi to Apollo from Philadelphia. Thank you, Apollo. Amy McIntyre is watching from the Pacific Northwest. Deborah Bernick is watching from DC. Ken Fisher is watching from the once purple state of Iowa. But relevant to what your comments, Kathy Ramirez mentioned the 14th Amendment and how it's under attack currently. And she says that it seems that the Supreme Court has been given so much power. It seems contrary. Speaking of the Supreme Court, what are your thoughts on President Biden's uh, suggestions around term limits for members of the Supreme Court?
I think it's a wonderful suggestion. The reform of the Supreme Court has been long overdue. No advanced democracy in the world today gives Supreme Court justices lifetime service. Think about the fact that there was a Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in the late 19th century who had once led the White League in Louisiana. So, we want a third branch of government, as maybe even the founders visualize, in a system of checks and balances. This notion of judicial review, where the Supreme Court can actually review the constitutionality of federal laws, was developed not in the Constitution, but under the Marshall Court, the first Supreme Court, and it
Hmm.
became precedent. Now, for the most part in its history, the Supreme Court has acted as a very conservative force and has acted in ways that has actually checked the growth of democracy. Under the Marshall Court, they acted somewhat correctly in trying to get the Jackson administration to respect treaties with Indian nations and to prevent the Trail of Tears. But Jackson said, "Oh, Justice Marshall has made his decision, let him enforce it." And he just ignored the Supreme Court.
Because the
And,
Supreme Court can't enforce
it's
their decisions
decisions.
on their own,
Exactly. It
right?
depends on how much reverence we have for it and, for the institution.
Yeah.
Um, and then, of course, you have these awful Supreme Court decisions like the Dred Scott decision that Lincoln eloquently sort of refuted in the Lincoln Douglas debates, where the Chief Justice Storney said that a black man has no right, that a white man is bound to respect. And he said that black people couldn't even sue for their freedom, which was complete nonsense because black people had been suing for their freedom since the colonial era. And in fact, that's how Massachusetts abolished slavery, because two enslaved people sued for their freedom. And then, of course, you have Plessy versus Ferguson and all those awful Reconstruction era Supreme Court decisions that completely emasculated the Reconstruction constitutional amendments and laws. So here we have a form of judicial activism. It's not just judicial review, but judicial activism where the Supreme Court is overreaching and encroaching in the executive and legislative powers of the president and Congress. It's certainly true in the period that is known as the fall of Reconstruction. And I will go back to one of my slides here to show you this.
So now we talk about we talked about Reconstruction and all the progressive legislation, all the advances that were made, and now we're going to talk about the fall of Reconstruction. And I was going to, we're running this ticker. We've been here before. You were talking about court cases. I just want to throw out to show that parallel. We have Citizens United, which gives corporations the same rights as people. Again, hard to wrap your head around that. Yeah, the Supreme Court taking down the Voting Rights Act, the key provisions that really was this progressive legislation, this not legislation, but this progressive movement from the 60s, 70s, and 80s being taken down again. So bring us back to the fall of Reconstruction, the unwinding, as you call it here.
Right, and the
Walk us
Supreme
through that.
Court plays a very bad role in that, right? We know that in the late 19th century, and the Warren Court, the Civil Rights Court, when they actually had the Supreme Court trying to enforce some of the Reconstruction era laws by, in Brown v. Board of Education, by attempting to ban racial segregation, conservatives accused the Supreme Court, cheekily enough, of judicial activism then. And if you look at the intent of many of these Reconstruction laws and amendments, that's exactly what they were trying to do. Many conservatives, excuse me, many conservatives actually pretend to be originalists, right? And obey the strict letter of the Constitution. But what the Supreme Court is doing today is way beyond that. They don't even respect some of our founding principles, whether it's separation of church and state or other aspects of our founding principles of American republicanism. And you put it well, right? If you look at Citizens United, that gave free speech rights to big money and has completely corrupted our election process. That happened during Reconstruction, where the Supreme Court interpreted the 14th Amendment that was explicitly designed to give protections to freed people as giving protections to corporations, particularly railroad corporations, and saying that the state could not regulate the economy, could not set minimum labor standards in terms of workplace safety or against child labor or minimum wage and maximum hours, because that went against the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause. Now, how ironic is that? They completely misinterpreted this amendment in order to give the protections. And our present day Supreme Court seems to be following the footsteps of the Reconstruction era Supreme Court. Justice Roberts, who puts on a moderate facade, but I think he's a compromise figure because, of course, he was the lead lawyer for Bush in Bush v. Gore. And that's where you see this judicial overreach by the Supreme Court. You can see that in the Rehnquist Court. It just starts then. And Roberts has pretty much taken that. You have two Supreme Court justices who are completely corrupt and partisan. And so I think what President Biden has proposed is very apt. Remember FDR's court packing plan?
Yeah,
when they tried to, undo the New Deal. And that scared them enough to bring them to their senses. Many people think that FDR's plan was unpopular because it was somehow going against precedent. But I think it is important in order to safeguard our democracy, in order to safeguard our rights to do this. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed in order to implement the 14th and 15th Amendments from nearly a century ago. So, we are back there, and I think that is important. But let me talk a little bit about the unwinding of Reconstruction, and you will see that I do put the 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson decision there that greenlighted Jim Crow. There was also the 1898 Williams versus Mississippi case in which the Supreme Court said, oh yeah, it's okay for Southern states to disfranchise Black men in complete contravention to the 15th Amendment, as long as they don't explicitly use race. So of course, Southern states invented all kinds of legal chicanery like, oh, the grandfather clause, you can vote only if your grandfather voted. Well, guess what? For most freed people, their grandparents were enslaved and they did not vote. Poll taxes, literacy taxes, literacy requirements, constitution understanding requirements, which I'm sure Trump would never pass. So all kinds of ways to disfranchise Black people. And this is why I say that those people who end the story of Reconstruction in 1877, that's not enough, that we really need to look at this concerted effort after 1877, the so-called compromise of 1877. Some people think, some historians dispute that there was even a compromise because, we don't have a smoking gun evidence for it. which was really a compromise that gave the electoral votes of Louisiana, Mississippi, and Florida to Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican candidate who became president after the 1876 presidential elections. And with that came the fall of the state governments, Reconstruction governments
Sure.
of Louisiana, Mississippi, and Florida. I'm saying you need to look beyond this
Sure.
moment to look at the unwinding of Reconstruction. You have to look at the 1890s in particular as a crucial decade when Mississippi became the first state to legally disfranchise Black people, and all Southern states followed its example. When you had the Chinese Exclusion Act leading the way to the 1924 immigration law that favored Northern and Western Europeans at the cost of Southern and Eastern Europeans, even. So when Trump said, we want immigrants from Norway, he was
Exactly.
referring to that legal regime. Most Asians, Chinese, including South Asians, would be excluded until the 1960s, whereas in the aftermath of the civil rights movement, even the immigration laws were liberalized. And in fact, the 1870 Naturalization Act passed during Reconstruction removed the racial bar for immigrating to the United States. The 1790s law had actually restricted it to people of white descent. But what I'm saying here is that you need to connect it to all these other national and international events. The Wounded Knee Massacre, which was the end of Native sovereignty, the conquest of the West, coincides with the fall of Reconstruction. So federal troops are no longer protecting Black rights. They're in fact undermining indigenous sovereignty in the
Yeah.
West. The Spanish-Cuban American War of 1898, which is not normally linked to the fall of Reconstruction, but this is the rise of a former overseas American empire. And this is the same year that you have the Wilmington Massacre, and you have a picture here of the group of men who overthrew the interracial city government of Wilmington, North Carolina. Right up to the 1890s, you actually had interracial governments, alliances between white populist farmers and Black Republicans in North Carolina. Even in Virginia and Tennessee, there were some fusion governments. But this was the final end to that dream of an interracial democracy. What's interesting about these people is that they were actually members of the Wilmington Light Infantry that had taken part in the Spanish-American War. So it's really important for us to remember that these things are connected.
Sure. Sure.
The establishment of a racist apartheid regime in the South, and at the same time, the quest for American empire, and thinking that some people, especially non-white people, are just incapable of self-government. Because the experiment in interracial democracy and Black citizenship had failed in the South, America really takes on the accoutrements of empire. There were anti-imperialists, of course, many of them old abolitionists and radical Republicans who formed the Anti-Imperialist League and said, we are a republic, not an empire. But that was the minority opinion by then. And you have the annexation of Hawaii. You have, of course, the colonization of the Philippines. There was a long and brutal war against the Filipino people, where many of the tactics that we associate with the Iraq War, like waterboarding and other kinds of torture techniques, were invented. Of course, you have the colonization of Puerto Rico. And finally, the Supreme Court in 1901, in the insular cases, insular because it applied to the island territories acquired by the United States, ruled that the 14th Amendment and its guarantee of citizenship and equal rights would not be applicable to these island territories, that they would be in a colonial status. And so it's important to remember these linkages between the rise of American imperialism and the fall of Reconstruction. Even with Cuba, which was not officially colonized, according to the Platt Amendment, they actually retained the right to intervene in Cuban affairs if American economic and strategic interests required it. So this is the rise of the informal American empire that we are so familiar with in the 20th and 21st centuries. So I think the downfall of democracy in the United States had these tremendous international implications that sometimes we are not aware of.
So when you look at that full, and so first of all, thank you for walking us through that. I think it's the critical thing is to look at that larger view of history. You're talking about the fall of Reconstruction. You're tracing kind of everything that was, from my perspective at least, bad that was happening between 1920, if you will, and 1965. Certainly earlier as well, around 1877. But then let's move the story forward, right? In 65, with the opening of immigration, with the civil rights movement, you talked about the poll taxes and literacy tests. That's when the civil rights movement really pushed back against that. And I've been, working on that. One of our clients is the John and Lillian Miles Lewis Foundation. So I've been, learning so much more and, excuse me, writing about that period of time and John Lewis's role in that history. But you see the gains that were made in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s. And I'll bring in a comment from Walter Grayson, who is a former guest on the show, a very close friend. And he says that Dr. Sinha shares essential historical insights. More historians needed in Sunday morning conversations. I'll take a quick glass of water. Mom, look, I'm drinking water. My mom will count how many times I drink water during the show. But it was Dr. Grayson who first opened my eyes to this idea of the excuse me, the the evolution in terms of the last several years, where there was progress and an understanding of diversity, et cetera, and then the clapback, the pushback from conservatives, the attacks on critical race theory as one example. Anything that former President Trump is saying, and the MAGA Republicans, that sense where people feel threatened and aggrieved, are now pushing back against the gains over the last several years. So
Yes.
we really are seeing this
Yeah.
repeat of history.
Absolutely. History, as Mark Twain said, does not repeat, it rhymes. And hopefully, we are not doomed to repeat the overthrow of Reconstruction. But thank you, Walter, so much. And also, thank you to your mom. Moms are very precious to us in Indian cultures. And
Absolutely.
I lost my 97-year-old mother this year in April. So
You did.
very suddenly, and she was like mentally and physically totally sharp right to the end. But she did get a copy of my book, and she was
Well,
really
that's good.
thrilled to get it and see herself in the acknowledgments, because she would talk to me every day in the morning and encourage me while I was writing. But to your point about what we are seeing today in terms of how we other people, right? That's what Donald Trump is doing.
Mm,
And that is, in fact, an extremely old strategy. In Reconstruction, Southern white elites, and I should say this, sometimes we talk about race in a very undistinguished way, but during Reconstruction, there were Southerners who were part of the Reconstruction Alliance, Southern white Republicans, mainly from the non slaveholding areas of the South, like in Western North Carolina or Eastern Tennessee. There are a lot of these people who actually form that alliance with freed people to form those interracial governments. So, Southern elites, their strategy was exactly what Trump is doing now, which is to use race in order to destroy this interracial alliance. There were
yeah,
also Northern whites, Northern Republicans who had come down. It's either through the Freedmen's Bureau or through the Union Army or as
sure.
teachers to help out in this whole transition from slavery to freedom, who were part of this alliance and who were also attacked and sometimes victims of domestic political terror by groups like the KKK. So we must remember that this attempt by Trump to make this a white versus black issue is an old Southern tactic.
Hmm.
It's part of Nixon's Southern strategy when Lyndon B. Johnson and the Democratic Party supported civil rights.
Sure.
And many times my students are confused about the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. And I'm like, everything you know about it today, just switch it for the
Flip
19th
it.
century. Totally flip
Absolutely.
it. It
Absolutely.
is the Democratic Party is the conservative party of states' rights and racism, both in the North and South. And it is the Republican Party that time that is the party of Lincoln, that is the party of anti-slavery and black rights. And that scenario starts changing with the New Deal when you have a massive realignment in political loyalties, but it is really cemented with the civil rights movement. And it seems to me that the Republican Party's entire platform, the so-called Reagan Revolution, which was really like a counter-revolution,
Yep.
because Reagan's ideas were to undo the New Deal state of FDR and undo the gains of the civil rights movement. And this is the political genealogy of the Republican Party. And
Hmm.
earlier on, it was dog whistles, it was the Willie Horton ads,
Yep.
it was attempts to undermine the Voting Rights Act, undermine civil rights gains. Now it is very upfront. There's no disguising of it. You have, plutocrats like Elon Musk, and I'm glad we are still on Twitter,
Yeah.
who are trying to interfere in the elections, who are against paying their fair share of taxes. Do you know that Southern elites began their opposition to Reconstruction by holding taxpayers' conventions? That the first income tax in United States history was implemented by President Abraham Lincoln. So it's really important for us or his administration, I should say, during the Civil War. So it's important for us to understand when people say, I'm against big government, but I'm for big government when it comes to intervening in people's lives and their rights. That these are very old ideas, and we should be aware of it.
Sure.
That we should be thinking about how Trump has really gone to the lowest common denominator in terms of racism. He says things that has become now okay to say publicly in this day and age, and that's why I find him so appalling. And we should also remember that Trump is part of a broader global authoritarian push
Yes.
um,
Absolutely.
led by people like Putin in
Yes.
Russia. He admires Xi in China, for instance.
Orban
Um,
in Hungary.
Orban in Hungary. I mean, they think
Bolsonaro in Brazil.
Bolsonaro in Brazil. I mean, it's all over the world, and they are quite open about it. They are quite open about imagining a society in which some people are lesser than.
Sure.
And that's just, a form of neo fascism. Because if you look back at the rise of fascism and Nazism, that's exactly what they did. This kind of uber nationalism, jingoism, and who gets to be an authentic member of a national community or a
Sure.
citizen. The American idea has always been different. The American idea has been an idea of civic nationalism, meaning you could come from any part of the world, but if you swore an oath to the ideals of the U.S. Constitution, and you were a citizen of the republic. It's also the French idea of republicanism. So I think it's really important for us, it may sound old fashioned, to hold up those ideas against these very racist, nativist, old ideas. Do we want to go back to the 100 Years' War of Europe between Protestants and Catholics? Do we want to go back to the 30 Years' War? Do we want to go back to the Anglo-French? These people are virtually medieval. And it
Sure.
doesn't surprise me that
Sure.
Alito actually looked at medieval jurists for his opinion in the Dobbs decision. So when Kamala Harris says we shall not go back, that's what she means. That we are a modern republic, we are a modern democracy, that we should be shoring up American republicanism, expanding our democracy rather than vice versa.
So I do, before we go to the New York Times, I do want to ask two questions, kind of taking a step back and kind of more broadly. One, um, talk to us about kind of your journey, your decision as a as an immigrant, as an Indian American working in African American history.
Mhm.
What is that? What was that like in terms of choosing that path? What has that experience been like? Because my experience and my understanding, and we try and keep it as real as possible. There is I would say it's a mixed bag in terms of relations between South Asians, Indians, and the Black community. In some places in the South, in particular, when they have split proms, for example, I have friends who grew up in the South. In some areas, Indians were grouped with the white community and they went to prom with whites and blacks were separate. In other places, Indians were grouped with the black community and they went to prom together. And I know that there is a lot of racism within our community. I think that it's something that, we all have to own and be aware of. But what was your what was your path and what's been your experience uh, as an Indian American academic studying African American history?
Yes, so when I came to the United States, I was 21 years old. I came to graduate school mainly because I wanted to do United States history, and you couldn't do it in India. You could do American Studies, which was a more literature focus at Osmania University in Hyderabad. So I decided to come to the US for my PhD. And one of my favorite movies then was Mississippi Masala. I don't know whether you've
Of
seen that.
course, of course.
I developed a complete crush on Denzel Washington, of course, and have had one since then. And I really am a historian of slavery, abolition, Civil War, Reconstruction, the long 19th century. I see African American history as an essential part of United States history. It had to grow as a subfield because it was ignored in mainstream US history, but now it's very much at the center of US history. I mean, how can you be a Civil War historian and not be a historian of slavery, right?
Of course, of course.
It was the issue of the times, as Lincoln himself said it. And so when I came here, I was very unusual because now there are a lot of Indian Americans who do the humanities. But when I came in the 80s, most Indian Americans were in the STEM fields.
Hmm.
They said, you're doing history and US history. It took them a long time to understand that fact. So when Kamala Harris was chosen as the vice presidential candidate by Joe Biden, I said, oh, it felt like a personal gift to me because suddenly, after living in this country for nearly 30, 40 years, I felt that, I was being represented in this country at the highest levels. And you saw that in Congress. I wrote an op ed about this for the New York Times 2020. And this is the reason why I wrote it, because you felt a sense of belonging. And of course, Indians can be an insular provincial community. I noticed that among some of my Indian American students whose parents had immigrated to this country in the 60s, unlike Kamala's mother, who seems to be just an amazing, heartbreaking woman. Um, they and who married an African American man. Where I'm
Jamaican.
sure
Yeah.
that was must have raised eyebrows then in an Indian community that rarely marries outside, sometimes even their own caste or religion. And so I found my Indian American students far more conservative on certain issues than I was, having grown up in India. And I think part of it is that I was interested in these histories, that I knew about the connections between Dr. King and his adoption of Mahatma Gandhi's notion of satyagraha, of the connections between the Black fight for equality and freedom in this country and the decolonization of Asia and Africa, including India. And I think a lot of Indians have become or became obsessed with skin color after being colonized by the British. And a value was, of course, put on race. This was a global phenomenon. It happened in the U.S. With Jim Crow. It happened in India with colonization. And you can see this, of course, with the rise of scientific racism, which had, Northern Europeans on top with lesser whites, Asians at the bottom, and Black people and Africans at the bottom.
Yeah.
This is the height of social Darwinism, scientific racism. those ideas about replacement theory, that somehow these dark hordes of the world will replace the so-called white race, that was very popular in the 1920s in the US. People like Madison Grant, and we were a colonized people, and I think it's still a symptom of a colonial mentality when we encounter racism within the Indian community. I found that when I grew up in India, I was uh, dark. I was a swimmer. I was always out in the sun all summer, and people would say, "No one's going to marry this girl because she's so dark." And
Yeah,
I always thought that was so objectionable to hear, because I knew that our goddesses were black. Kali, which literally means black,
sure.
and I could see how our colonization by Europeans and by the British had done serious psychological harm to our communities. And so when I see that happening today, and when my sons were shocked when they went to India and saw all these skin whitening creams being hawked on TV, I always told them, you to understand all that, you have to understand history. So I'm a big proponent on that. So let that be my last message, that
Absolutely.
history matters,
Yes.
and that sometimes to understand the present, we have to look at the past, and we have to look at how that should inform our future. And I think that's really consequential right now for the United States, as we are on the eve of probably one of the most consequential presidential elections, which will really show us whether we will go through another period of nadir, as the great Black historian Rayford Logan put it, for the late 19th century, the nadir of Black freedom and American democracy. Or, in fact, we will chart out a different path, a more hopeful path for the United States, not only as a democracy, but also as a world power. That we will not, in fact, be selling our national security secrets to the highest bidder, and not be under the thumb of a Russian dictator. As Abraham Lincoln said, when it comes to that, the base alloy of hypocrisy, he said, I'd rather just immigrate to Russia than live in a country that pretends to be free, but that practices autocracy.
Absolutely. We're going to turn our thoughts to the present in just a moment, but I want to bring in a few additional comments. Mary Curtis saying that what a relevant conversation. As I watched from NABJ in Chicago, where we were making news with the Trump appearance, of course. Um, Patricia Freudenberg, the book book seems like it gets right to the point of pivotal moments in history. Naomi Sears, your book will make a terrific addition to my collection. Some great comments from earlier, and then more recently, Rednia Haldapur sharing that this is not African American history, in my opinion. It's American history, is what I would add to that, um, and several other comments as well. So thank you everyone for watching. Thank you for all of your comments and insights. Let's go ahead and turn our attention now to more recent events, and we'll cover the paper for about 20 minutes before we close the show at 10 o'clock. So I'll step over here. I'll step over to the paper so that we can talk about what's in the news. And Manisha, the way that we handle it, if you see something interesting, please feel free to jump in and comment. And if not, we'll just take a quick review. We talked about this article. Trump paints his opponent as an other, old tactic that is so suspicion about Harris. So let's see what else is in the front section. The A book. We have the Inside the Times, inside the Shakespearean drama of the Murdochs. Times reporters reflect on the revelation and implications of a clandestine legal battle. We have a Dateline section where Times journalists are reporting around the world, from Tahiti, Berlin, Kigali, Rwanda, and India. Peter Goodman and Hari Kumar rode with Raghib Khan, a long haul trucker from Manesar to Jaipur. The journey they rode revealed a significant gap between India's infrastructure and that of other large Asian economies. David Dunlap has a great piece in times past, exploring an artifact from the archives of the New York Times. Uh, Call it the rough draft of the first draft of history. almost exactly 18 hours after the New York Times scrambled into action to cover the attempted assassination of former President Donald Trump, uh, Randall Archibald outlined on a yellow notepad how Times journalists would cover and try to make sense of the event. There was a little uh, nice piece of history right there. So let's see what else we have in the international section. Amid industrial soot and stench, Canada creates a park. This is in Windsor, Ontario. Um, and at the bottom of the paper, and I'll fold this up so you can see it. At 7, she thought she might like the matter. Now she's Iceland's president. That's an interesting evolution there. We have an interesting ad. We like paying attention to the ads in the paper. This one is powered to the instead of the courts, the people. Abortion, voting, gun safety, clean water, housing. The MAGA Supreme Court justices are stealing our most precious freedoms, suppressing our vote, and empowering a dictator. And then the big headline: This November, Supreme Court is on the ballot. Join the fight and vote to fix our court before it's too late. Uh, and then this is United for Democracy paid for this full page color ad in the Times. Um, we have an article about Azerbaijan hosting the climate talks, um, and it has a steep learning curve. Uh, let's see what else do we have as we get to the U.S. Coverage. This is more about Gaza and the assassinations in the Middle East and Tehran. Uh, Continuing that effort, we're going to go through this a little bit quickly. Want to certainly make uh, draw attention to the prisoner exchange that took place just a few days ago that released, among others, Evan Gershkovich of the Wall Street Journal. Very happy to see him come home. That was a huge uh, development. So here is a huge article. So full page, what Kamala Harris learned. The headline is just under the picture. What Kamala Harris learned from a bruising 2020 primary, and they have make it really easy in terms of the layout for her to read the highlights. She got comfortable with her prosecutor past. Her abortion position stands out. She's willing to reject the left. This picture with Bernie Sanders at the debate. It's better to have the party on your side. So not just good journalism, but props on the layout to make it easier and more accessible. Here is the article. Trump portrays his opponent as an other. Um, the Time Worn tactic tries to sow doubts among voters about vice president. And so here's the historical precedents. Al Smith was the target of Republican attacks, charging that the Roman Catholic presidential nominee would be beholden to the Pope. We obviously saw that again with John F. Kennedy when he was running. Joseph Biden as well, I think, to a certain extent. Ray shadowed the 1989 mayoral campaign between David Dinkins and Rudolph Giuliani in New York. I remember that campaign. In 2008, John McCain corrected a woman, and this is below the fold, so I want to show that to folks. John McCain corrected a woman at a rally who falsely said Barack Obama was an Arab. So at least there's a positive example there. Um, can we just take a moment as we're looking at this, how far Rudolph Giuliani has fallen since his time as America's mayor? Just incredible in terms of um, how that brief, how that.
Neil, I am
I
so
see that,
sorry.
Misha.
Neil, I am so sorry to. I really enjoyed your going through the New York Times today because I usually get the print version at home, but I'm in Lake Placid in New York, so I haven't gotten my
Absolutely,
New York Times. So just having you run through it was really helpful. But
sure,
unfortunately, I do have to leave right now because I have another commitment at 10 to which I
sure.
have to go to. So I am sorry that I have to leave you
No,
a bit early.
we thank you so much for joining us, Manisha. This was great. It's as Walter said, we should have more historians on the show to give that perspective. And thank you so much. Thank you. Good luck with the book.
Thank
And
you.
again, I do want to say you mentioned it earlier, but condolences on your mom. who passed away in the spring. We were planning on having you join us closer to when the book came out, but we're glad we were able to have you now, especially after all the news with Kamala. The timing worked out.
Exactly.
Um,
Thank you
so
so much. Thank you so
thank
much
you.
for having
We'll
me.
we'll continue with the paper, and good luck with the rest of your conference in
Thank
Lake
you.
Placid. Bye
Bye bye.
bye. So that was, of course, Manisha Sinha, a professor of history at UConn, University of Connecticut. She is the author of The Rise and Fall of the Second American Republic, Reconstruction 1860 to 1920. Certainly uh, encourage you to get the book and to read it. As I mentioned, we will continue with the paper for whoopsie. Sorry about that. We will continue with the paper for just a few minutes till about 10 o'clock. While we have your attention, I just want to make a few announcements. We do not have a show next week. We'll take the weekend off. As I mentioned, Pam and I are going to a wedding, so we will be out of town. But your loss is my mom's gain, because I'll be having dinner with my mom Friday night up in New York. I also want to let you know about the next show of Shining Light on Shadows, a candid conversation about mental health. We have another show coming up Thursday, August 8th. Uh, we're going to be focusing on in person versus online therapy. Grace Hipona is a therapist herself. She'll share her perspectives. Dawn and I will share our experience as well. We have been doing this show since February. The goal is to reduce the stigma around mental health, to normalize the conversation around therapy, around anxiety, around depression. I'll say personally that I had never shared that I went to a therapist or suffered from anxiety and occasional depression until we started this show. But it's been great. Appreciate all the support that we've gotten so far. And we also want to mention that so 2 weeks from now, August 18th, Mike Riley will be joining us. He's a data and digital journalism professor at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and he will be talking about AI and journalism. AI and journalism. So let's go ahead and get back to the paper, and we will continue taking a look at what's in the Sunday paper, and then we will close out the show at about 10 o'clock. So thank you again for joining the New York Times read along. If you joined us late, you can always catch the show from the beginning on Facebook, on Twitter, on LinkedIn, on YouTube, and our Digimentors website, and watch at your convenience. So thank you very much. We were looking at the how politicians have been portrayed as the other over time. And here's another article. Harris isn't talking about identity, and voters are fine with that. And I think that's an interesting question. I'd be curious to what folks think that are watching the show. Should Kamala Harris talk more about her identity? Should or not? I think that I like it when she talks about her background and identity. So let's put that question up there um, and see what people think. We'll run that across the bottom as a ticker for folks. That's great. And a few comments that came in through Instagram, just want to follow up. Sorry we didn't catch these earlier. Sujana Chandrasekhar said, I need to sign up for Professor Sinha's class. Kimberly said that when I, in East Asian, was a kid at my friend's pool party, her East Asian parents and elders always made passive aggressive comments about my darker skin. Made me feel small then, but proud now. Thank you for sharing that, Kimberly. Really appreciate that. Um, she also said Giuliani's fall from grace was really incredible, and I certainly agree. So thank you for sharing that. Um, we have Sashi said, learned so much about American history with Professor Sinha. Thank you so much, Shashi. Appreciate that. Okay, so a few other articles. We have more on the presidential election, and this article that about a scientist defending an audacious plan to block sunlight and cool the earth. So that's on the front page. In the opinion section, there are definitely some articles worth noting. The front, Trump says it doesn't matter how he pronounces Kamala. He's wrong, and absolutely. Couldn't agree more. We have a couple other op-eds that we can, columns we can look at. There's a piece about the Biden proposal to reform the Supreme Court. Biden issues a stinging dissent. And here's a piece. The founder saw 2024 coming. The author of The Revolutionary, Samuel Adams. Aged candidates, presidential crimes, ignorant voters. The nation's fathers expected this. So that's going to be worth taking a look at. Here are several pieces where some of the Times columnists went against kind of popular opinion. Our world is more connected than ever, but it's never been easier to find yourself shepherded into a comfortable herd made up of close friends or political allies, an echo chamber, people who agree with you. So these are several unpopular opinions from Times writers. From David Brooks, many people fear AI. They shouldn't. From Zeynep Tufekci, and I'm apologizing, I'm pronouncing that wrong. Politicians say we're more divided than ever. It could be worse. People say queer people are born that way. Charles Blow says it's more complicated. Brett Stevens, conservatives think the market always gets it right. It doesn't. Brett Stevens, a conservative columnist. Let's see what else we have here. Tracy McMillan Cottom, don't hate on the DMV. She says it's actually great. Pamela Paul, the saying goes, dogs are man's best friend. She says cats are better. Lydia Paulgreen, we're taught to hate hypocrisy. We shouldn't. Michelle Goldberg, mothers are told natural childbirth is best. It isn't. So some contrary opinions worth taking a look at. Always good to expand your perspectives. David French, some think what you preach matters more than what you do. David French says it doesn't. And I actually want to note, I like the layout and the design here, where they do the color of the author with their contrary opinion underneath, if you see that. So some nice touches by the New York Times design team. And then here is that article, How Trump Says Kamala Matters, by John McWhorter. Mispronouncing the vice president's first name has the effect of othering her. Absolutely. Absolutely. And then they have a piece about 14 Democrats size up Kamala Harris with several thoughts on the economy, etc. As we're approaching the end of the show, here is sports. We'll just straighten up the paper just a little bit, and check to see. Nivedita says, Kumar says we must speak up about racism within our communities in terms of caste and color. Absolutely. Commenting on LinkedIn. Thank you very much for sharing that. And we have a number of other comments that are coming in. Let's keep that going. So thank you very much for all of your comments and suggestions. We will continue to look at sports. Who's watching the Olympics? Who is following? This was interesting. This cover photo, Julian Alfred, right, held off the favorite, Sha'Carri Richardson, in the 100 meters dash for St. Lucia's first Olympic gold. So I thought that was interesting. We have the business section We have dark web drug lord, FBI sleuth, crypto entrepreneur. An article about the
Sorry, folks, we had a technical difficulty. We lost the feed for a moment. My apologies. Again, I want to remind you that next week we will have Mike Riley joining us, and he will be our guest. Not next week, sorry, August 18th. Mike Riley will be joining us on the read along. We don't have a show next week. We're taking the weekend off so that we can so Pam and I can go to a wedding. Um,
So we are back. Apologize for that. We'll bring the newspaper back up and share with you, and we'll close out the show in just a moment. There we go. So there's that story about human resources. Exasperated by human resources, get in line. Even managers in the department say the job has turned exasperating. Sunday Styles, Marina Abramovich wants to live, laugh, and love. At 77, the performance artist is embracing old age as she looks to the future, and that's a very interesting way they did the photo. You can see the top half, a nice portrait of her, but it's reflected presumably on a table underneath. So that's interesting. And then here's a piece: Needles, Ink, and a Graphic History, a new tattoo convention in Terminal 5 in Manhattan. Covered all the bases with flair. Arts and Leisure, guided by Baldwin, a legacy lives on. Michelle, and I don't know how to pronounce her last name, their last name, who has a new album, No More Water, The Gospel of James Baldwin, discusses the past, the present, and artistic evolution. Plus, The Writer's Blues for Mr. Charlie, 60 years after it hit Broadway. That's Art and Leisure. Book review is Freeze Frame. In Frostbite, the Frostbite, Nicola Twilley traces the ways the modern world depends on and is deformed by refrigeration. And the New York Times Magazine is a cover story about John Hinckley, American gunman. 43 years ago, he shot the president in a delusional bid for attention, one in a long line of disturbed young men to the arc of the nation's history, by Mark O'Connell. That is the New York Times Magazine cover story. So with that, we want to thank you for joining us for another edition of Sri's Sunday New York Times Read Along. We had a fascinating discussion with Professor Manisha Sinha. If you joined us late, we certainly encourage you to watch the show from the beginning on the same links on Facebook, on Twitter, on LinkedIn, on YouTube, and our Digimentor's website just shortly after we finish the show. It'll take a little longer to get the video up on Instagram, but we'll put it up there as well. A few comments that we weren't able to get to earlier. Let's see what we have. Deborah says, a great review on the history of Blacks and minorities, immigrants of color in the U.S. Thanks. Sujana is pointing out, where's the breathless coverage of Trump's 10 million from Egypt? Where's the horror at Trump felicitating Putin last night? What's wrong with the media? These are all good questions, Sujana. Absolutely, this is missing from the conversation. let's see. Patricia Freudenberg says, thank you, Manisha, and the entire production team of the New York Times Read Along. This week, the entire production team is right here, hosting and producing at the same time. Sujana says, it is nice to hear about mental health throughout the Olympics as well. Absolutely. Simone Biles, her story, her challenges in Tokyo, but her ability to talk about it publicly and for the media to cover it is incredible. And so it's been very inspiring to see her share that. Shashi says, I learned so much about American history with Professor Sinha. Thank you so much. My mom, very impressive and educational show. Thanks, Mom. Always appreciate it. And in Facebook, Rose is sharing a link to the thread that I mentioned earlier from Dr. Joshi, her commentary about the attacks on Kamala Harris and her identity. And Mary Curtis says it's interesting that folks are saying that Kamala needs a white male running mate, but it's only considered identity politics when we're talking about Black folks and people of color. Absolutely agree with you, Mary. Thank you so much for your thoughts. So that's another show. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks. We won't be with you next week, but we will see you on August 18th. Thank you, and enjoy your summer. Bye-bye.